It's been incredible for me. I've only moved to Ballarat in January, so finding my feet here has been really, really fast, and I've loved every second of it, so long may it continue. As Aaron said, I'm a furniture maker, but my background was in architecture, so I studied in Glasgow, Eindhoven, and then came to Melbourne Uni to do my master's. So I've always taken the process of architecture and looked at my furniture as scaled down pieces of architectural craft. When I graduated, I worked for 5 years for Tandem Design Studio, a Melbourne firm, mainly doing residential work. I loved the projects, I loved the people I worked for, but the actual process of architecture to me was very slow. And I've got to be careful because there's architects in the room. But I found that projects getting held up in planning was pretty soul destroying. So I went back and re-examined the things that were important to me, the things I liked as a child. I was always inspired by my late grandfather, who was an architect, furniture designer, and builder. OH&S standards have obviously changed somewhat since the 80s. But yes, I went back and really looked at what I wanted to do. So fortunately, I stumbled upon a studio space in Kensington in the Young Husband building. It was cheap, accessible. You're surrounded by so many other businesses on all different fields of craft. The joy of working in a heritage building on the right-hand side. But it allowed you to bounce off other studios. Once that building went into planning for apartments, I moved into Jack's Magazine, which is a gunpowder magazine in Maribyrnong. Again, a little hidden pocket of Melbourne, which is where makers live. And it's something that's being squeezed out and pushing us out into regional Victoria, which is a good thing, I think. The space was incredible. It had the original train lines for the gunpowder trolleys that connected the whole space, which I changed into a movable workbench. It had natural light, which my first studio didn't have, which is pretty important when you're trying to finish timber. But yeah, that came to an end in January, and I moved here. One of the things that I always enjoyed from architecture was architectural model making and the quick exploration of form, shadows, space, enclosure. This was a scale model I did for John Wardle for the Venice Biennale Pavilion, which went ahead, which is excellent. This is going to date me as well, but my first year in architecture school, we didn't use computers. But it's something that I've taken into my furniture design. So all my concepts, initial concepts to clients, will be presented in sketch format, which I think buys me a bit of malleability, like as opposed to a CAD rendering where it's like set in stone. I find that a sketch is more easily presented and understood by clients. This was probably my third commission that I did for a 3.6 meter long entertainment unit, and I made it in a 3 meter by 3 meter workshop. So you can imagine the kind of gymnastics that were involved in it. But yeah, a really nice piece, and it really sparked my desire to work with only Australian timbers. Something else that I took from architecture was the way in which you diagram things and the way diagramming can influence your design. I always find that using dynamic modeling forms such as stretching, pulling, pushing could influence the design of the piece and make it easy to explain to clients. When we're talking about proportion, you often hear things like golden ratio banded about. It was something that I never really wanted to follow. So I have a lot of ratio in my pieces, but it tends to be repetitive dimensions and repetitive patterns. But yeah, I always think if you're going to make a piece tall, make it really, really tall, or wide, you make it really wide. And this is one of the examples of, like, I wanted to make a low table, so it had to be super low. It was for clients that had just moved to the Macedon Ranges, and they wanted to actually map the landscape and the features in the landscape on the piece. So we did it through brass inlays, mapping the creeks and rivers. They collected basalt samples from the peaks, and I marked all the peaks of the dormant volcanoes throughout the piece. But I wanted to add another layer of meaning to it. So I did a bit of research into indigenous storytelling around the area, and there was Dreamtime stories about mythical swamp creatures that would sort of walk around the area. So there's like an animalistic, kind of anamorphic design to the piece. It's made from spotted gum. Like I said, only work with indigenous timbers, which is going to be fun when the native logging ban really kicks in. But if anybody wants to talk about that, I'm more than happy to talk about that afterwards. This was a collaborative piece that I did with John Wardle. It's called in clover, so it had these clover-shaped legs, which are obviously much easier to sketch than they are to actually make in practice. So I worked with a CNC company to develop a technique where each leg was made in a quadrant and milled and paired and rotated around and then milled. It was done in 2021 through all the lockdowns, so it was a pretty tricky piece. Exhibited in Heidi Museum Modern Art. The top is Tasmanian oak. The legs are leatherwood, which you can't actually commercially mill anymore because of the bee industry. So it was pulled out of the bottom of a lake in Tasmania. I wanted to show this slide to explain the development of pieces. So this was one of my early pieces that I made called Pinch Bench, and I wanted to enter it for competition. I wanted to make a dark and moody piece. And my thing was always trying to market my furniture as artwork. So I looked into fashion photography and iconography and things like that. So to create that photo where it sort of looked like dripping oil, we bought 10 jars of molasses and spent the day making an absolute mess of this photography studio. And just a couple of examples of the different finishes and things that I work with. So tinted concrete and polished brass. This piece, if you come down to Craft Lab, you'll see it. It's called The Dish, and it geographically and historically locates a star map to parks in New South Wales when it started broadcasting the moon landing. So the inlay is all brass rod. Yeah, like I said, if you come down to Craft Lab in the mining exchange, you'll see it. There's one kind of halfway made. A piece that was inspired by a trip to Japan called Yakita. It's based on sort of the hinoki stools that you'd see in onsen bathhouses, extruded. The top is charred, again, a reference to Japanese architecture and design, and the lower shelf is a Danish cord weave just to add texture to the piece. That's it.